Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and today's video is a long time coming for me. I've wanted to talk about this for a while, and it's revisiting the Kawhi Leonard trade from the San Antonio Spurs to the Toronto Raptors. And I don't do this very often, but I'm definitely going to be bringing down the San Antonio Spurs a little bit in this video, just based off the package that they received for a player as good as Kawhi Leonard and what it's going to potentially mean for their future moving forward. But really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy the NBA, then consider subscribing. I upload basically every single day. Okay, so I think it's a good idea to look back on trades in general and kind of understand where the value is coming from and why a trade went down the way that it did. And this Kawhi trade specifically, I feel like is going to be something where we're going to look back on it in 2035 and think, why in the world is this all that San Antonio got back for Kawhi Leonard? Now, let's go through some of the context of the situation, because I do think it's worth revisiting and pointing out not only the circumstances of the trade, but just how good Kawhi Leonard was in San Antonio. So this is a guy who in the 2016-17 season won Defensive Player of the Year, was first team All-NBA, placed third in the MVP voting behind Russell Westbrook and James Harden, led his team to 61 wins in the regular season, and was widely regarded as, at worst, a top 5 to 7 player in the entire league. Oh, and by the way, he'd already won a championship a few years earlier as well, and won the Finals MVP. And in that 2016-17 season, it was also becoming clear that he was on his way to becoming an elite playoff player, much like the version that we saw in Toronto last season. In 12 games in the 2017 playoffs, he averaged over 27 points per game on only 17 shots, which is ridiculous efficiency, shooting 45% from three, over 90% from the free throw line on 8.5 attempts per game, and also playing great defense and dishing out 4.5 assists for good measure. And then it started to all come crumbling down. Zaza Pachulia puts his foot underneath Kawhi Leonard on a jump shot in Game 1 of the Western Conference Finals that year. He never returns in the series, and he only plays a handful more games for San Antonio in the rest of his entire career that following season, after a saga that we will get into in a moment. And the most crushing part about this, I'm sure, for Spurs fans, is there's no way to know what would have happened if that injury had never happened, and how it was maybe related to the leg injury that he then went on to complain about, and how just the medical staff issue, the distance between him and the team definitely grew as a result of whatever medical issue he had or didn't have. Some of the details are still fuzzy. But I have no doubt in my mind, zero, that the San Antonio Spurs would have won the Western Conference Finals that year and probably won the championship as well, because in the postseason they were fantastic. Leonard was playing out of his mind, and you could make the argument that even as good as the Warriors were that year, that the Spurs were the best team in the league that season, just because of how well Kawhi was playing and how well they were playing as a team. So there's the context around how good Kawhi Leonard was back in 2017. Obviously, he was traded in 2018, and there's a whole gap in between there in terms of the injury-riddled season where he only played 9 games and the distance between him and the team and all that. There's other context involved, but just in terms of how good this guy was back in 2017, consider that. And then think about the fact that they traded him in exchange for a second-tier scoring guard that always sucked in the playoffs, a rotation big, and a late first-round pick. And that's it. And compare that package, DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a late first-round pick, to the package that the Thunder received for Paul George this past summer. Danilo Gallinari, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, 2 starting caliber players, SGA, potential future All-NBA player, and then like 8,000 first-round picks. The difference in compensation here is insane. Now, what that contrast shows is the power of leverage in trade negotiations in the NBA. It isn't necessarily an indictment on the Spurs' ability to negotiate a trade, although we will get to that later, but the Thunder knew that they had all of the leverage in the Paul George situation. They had him under contract for multiple years. They didn't need to trade him away in that moment, but they knew that they could get a ton of value because the Clippers wanted him so badly. They knew that they were essentially trading for both Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, and there was really no limit to the price that they would be willing to pay, and you can see that in the amount of first-round picks and the amount of overall compensation that they traded away for George. While on the other hand, the Spurs were dealing with a much different situation. Most of the league at the time that they actually made the move was very, very aware that Kawhi Leonard was not happy in San Antonio and wanted to be moved, and he made that request known to the Spurs, and again, it was well known around the league. Not only that, he'd only played in 9 games the season before, nobody really knew how healthy he was, and to make it even worse for San Antonio, it was a 1-year rental for most teams because Leonard had established a handful of teams that he actually wanted to play for, and any other team that would make the move for him was risking a chance that he would just leave the following season, as he eventually did for Toronto. So the Spurs really had barely any leverage here, and I'm completely understanding of that and why there's such a difference between the compensation received for Leonard compared to George. Now, understanding all of that context and having gone through how good Kawhi was and how much the leverage mattered and the situation around Leonard's trade, I still go back and look at this and think, this is seriously all you got in exchange for Kawhi Leonard. Like, I'm really not trying to be disrespectful to DeMar Derozan, but the gap between him in the postseason and Kawhi Leonard in the postseason in terms of their performances is a huge, huge gap. And then the only other pieces you're getting are Poeltl, who's a rotation center, and you can get those pretty easily in the league, and then a late first-round pick. Like, that's the only gap that you think there is between the value of Kawhi, even with everything going on with him. You think the only gap in value between him and DeMar Derozan is a rotation center and a late first? That doesn't seem to make very much sense to me. So as we go back and look at this and revisit this, why did this go down this way? Why did the Spurs only get this in exchange for Kawhi, other than just the context of his injury and potentially being a rental? Well, it seems like they didn't want to trade him within their own conference, which immediately cut out half of the league. And that initially makes sense, right? You don't want to be playing Kawhi all the time. He's a great player. You know that he's a great player. And if he comes back healthy, you don't want to be playing him between 3 and 4 times a year, right? That makes complete sense. The problem with that mindset is Kawhi was probably always going to end up in LA. It seems very likely that the long-term plan was always he wanted to be a Laker or he wanted to be a Clipper. So basically, you're only saving yourself 1 year of playing Kawhi in the same conference, because now you have to play Kawhi in the same conference. And there's obviously no way of exactly knowing, right, that he was going to end up in LA, but it seemed pretty likely that it was going to be the Clippers or the Lakers if you're the Spurs. So they're sitting there saying, okay, we know we have to trade Kawhi. We know we have all these issues. We know that we have limited leverage. Let's further limit ourselves by saying we're only trading him to 1/2 of the league. And then that allows teams like Toronto to come up with an offer that is a complete lowball offer in hindsight, because they know that they're only competing with a handful of other teams in the Eastern Conference that would even bother for trading him. So yes, they had limited leverage to begin with, but they made it even worse on themselves to save what is more than likely going to be 1 year of not having Kawhi Leonard in the conference. And that just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, looking back on it, would they really not have been able to just say, hey, we want Brandon Ingram and some contracts in exchange for Kawhi Leonard? Or would the Lakers really not take that? I'm not sure. I don't have any insider information, but I feel like they would be pretty willing to make that move given their situation at the time. Other teams around the league in the Western Conference, I'm sure, would have had better trade packages than DeRozan and a center and a pick in exchange for Kawhi Leonard. And it's honestly infuriating to look back and think, this is a franchise that has done so many things correctly over the last 20 to 25 years, and it's an incredible franchise. They've made some questionable moves lately, like this Leonard thing and some of the contracts that they've given out, but for the most part, they're getting a legacy award for the best franchise of the last 20 to 25 years, right? So to do all of those things correctly, it's frustrating to see them have an opportunity to continue to push towards the future. Even though the Kawhi thing was unfortunate, they had this massive trade piece that they could have set themselves up extremely well for the future, and they failed to do so. Now, maybe I'm grading them on a curve because, in a negative way, because they have been so good, and I'm expecting them to be really good in these future moves, and it just didn't end up working out that way, and maybe I'm punishing them for being so good in the past. But it still feels like they just completely screwed this up. The only other thing that I can think of that would allow this to make sense in my mind is that the LA teams were not interested in trading for Kawhi at the time because they felt confident in their ability to bring him in free agency the following summer, right? Like, this is a Carmelo Anthony to the Knicks type situation here, where the Knicks made a trade to Denver. They traded away a lot of their future assets in exchange for Melo, when they probably could have just waited until the offseason and signed him then, and it gutted them of what could have been a really promising roster while Melo was there and while Amari Stoudemire was still healthy. So maybe the Lakers and the Clippers were looking at this situation, and that's what they were thinking. They felt good about their ability to sign Kawhi Leonard in the offseason after having seen him for an entire season, ideally, and fully understanding of the medical issues and if he's actually going to be healthy or not. And that avenue makes more sense for them. So at the very least, they're not going to trade nearly as much, and maybe that Brandon Ingram situation wasn't on the table. But even with that, I find it very, very hard to believe that there weren't better offers that they could have gotten if they'd opened it up to the entire league rather than just one half of the conference. And this ends up being maybe the greatest trade of all time, certainly the most impactful trade of all time in terms of immediately winning a championship, because the Raptors with their roster before the Leonard trade were not winning the title, and then they won one afterwards because Leonard was so great for them. And when you consider how great of a trade it was for Toronto, it's frustrating that the Spurs didn't look at the situation with a little bit more of a long view and say, hey, we should really try and get a ton of value out of a guy that, when healthy, is one of the 5 best players in the entire league. And yeah, there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.